I'm going to now ask Greg Marks to speak to us. Hi, Greg.
G'day, Larissa.
Greg is an international human rights law expert specialising in Indigenous rights, and he's lived and worked in the Northern Territory and has retained a very close interest in those issues. He's also a Centre Associate of the Indigenous Law Centre at the University of New South Wales and formerly the convener of the Indigenous Rights Committee of the International Law Association. He has done a lot of hard yards in the area of Indigenous rights, particularly from an international perspective, and he's going to share some insights with us now. Thanks, Greg.
Thanks, Larissa.
Welcome, Greg.
Thank you. And good evening, everybody who's on this forum. I'll be looking away from the camera a bit to look at my notes, so I apologise for that. What I want to do is just to try and provide, from how I understand it, an overview of the changes in government policy impacting on Aboriginal communities in the Territory over the past 15 years. So I'm taking the perspective a little bit wider than 13 back to the intervention, because I think some of these things started a couple of years before the intervention and they all sort of work together. So I think there's been like a tsunami of change coming from a few different directions at the Northern Territory and causing a lot of damage to the lives of Aboriginal people. And so I thought I'd just try and take some of the different strands out and then sort of put them back together again, because I think it's a little bit hard to track all these different elements of this stuff, which is partly the way that governments get away with these things. So I'll just start, I'll put one critical date for a start, 2004, because 2004 was the abolition of ATSIC. And once ATSIC was out of the way, the government had a clear run, because there's no large, resourced, independent body to call them out. So it loaded the dice in the favour of government. Now, the main strands of this tsunami, as I see it, I see three. The first one is so-called Land Tenure Reform. That's where Aboriginal townships are leased back to the government for 99, 40 years. So that started in 2006, just before the intervention actually started. That reform, and I think this picks up what Harry was saying, that reform is all about, is all about control. It's the Commonwealth Government taking back control of major Aboriginal communities across the Territory. The government needed an excuse, and the excuse is security of assets. They say they will not fund houses, schools, infrastructure without a lease. I mean, they did so for 30 years before that, but suddenly found that it was impossible without a lease. So what is the motive behind this land tenure reform, they call it? And the motive, I'm quite sure, is to get traditional owners out of the decision-making process. That's the main objective. So no matter what level of consultation might go on after a 99-year lease is signed, really, it's the government that makes the decisions for the next 99 years. So that's 3 or 4 generations. So the control of the land for the communities to sign up, as I see it, is effectively alienated. It's lost to Aboriginal people. And these communities are where the majority of Aboriginal people outside the regional towns live. So it's a major target, really. So another object of this tenure reform was to break up communal ownership. So the argument was that residents would be able to own their homes by subleases. Now the government was just hooked on individuals owning homes because that's what white people do, basically. So that's one strand I see, and it's not quite the intervention, but it's also part of the intervention. The second strand, and the most dramatic, of course, is the intervention itself. It's changes to a whole lot of stuff. We know social security, compulsory leases, police stations, customary law, all those things are talked about. And for that, as we know, any excuse would do for public consumption, and the Little Children Are Sacred report provided perfect cover for the intervention. So here we had the army, government business managers. So it was a massive rollback of the right to self-determination. It imposed discriminatory measures, got rid of the protections of the Racial Discrimination Act, used the bogus excuse of special measures, which with special measures what they basically said was that we're going to take away your rights so we can give you rights. So it's not, it doesn't really add up, of course. But I don't need to go on with that because everybody knows about intervention. Aboriginal people have lived the thing and are talking about it tonight. Aboriginal people have been to the UN about it. UN special rapporteurs have been to Australia and criticised it. And then, of course, you've got Stronger Futures, which is Mark II of the intervention. So that's the second strand. That's the one we're celebrating, if that's the right word, tonight, the 20th anniversary. The third strand of this tsunami is the one that I want to really emphasise tonight because it's, at least to the wider public, it's the one least known. It's the attempted slow death of the outstations movement. So this time, the excuse was that outstations and homeland communities were not viable, and that was the excuse. So the government from about 2005 on wanted to get rid of outstations and homelands. There's absolutely no doubt about that. I've sat across the board from the architects of these policies, and that's what it's all about, getting rid of outstations and homelands. But they were too smart to just try and close them all down at once. For one thing, there were too many people living on outstations, so to close them down straight away, that would have been too difficult. So what they went for instead was what I'm calling the slow strangulation approach, the starving of funds and services approach. So this sounds pretty cynical, but they were prepared for older Aboriginal people to live out their lives in homelands communities. What they were after was the younger generations, to get them into larger communities or towns, to break their connection, their attachment to their traditional country. So the approach was to give the outstations no real future, to stop them growing, to make daily life a struggle, a battle just to keep things going. And this is where the defunding of outstation housing came in. That's the critical element. Other things too, but that's the critical element. And the key to that was a memorandum of understanding, an agreement between the Commonwealth Government and the NT Government about accommodation and infrastructure on Aboriginal communities. And that agreement was signed in September 2007. So that comes just 2 or 3 months after the intervention. But of course, these things aren't coincidental. With that MOU, well, the NT government was over a barrel. It was one of those things where you don't have a choice. They had to sign up. And no Aboriginal organisations at all were ever involved in the development of this critical MOU. So the arrangements for in that MOU, the arrangements for outstations and homelands funding since self-government in 1978 were completely overturned. So this is a radical move, and not a single Aboriginal organisation was involved. And really, the NT government, if you look at the letters between Claire Martin and John Howard, the NT government were really had nowhere to turn. They either signed up to this MOU or they got nothing for housing. So the Commonwealth said in that MOU that there would be no more Commonwealth funding for new or rebuilt or refurbished housing and infrastructure on those communities. So they just threw the outstations and homelands communities to the NT government, knowing that it did not have the resources to take this up. So the MOU specifically, it's there in black and white, ruled out support for 500 communities across the territory. That was a lot of communities and a lot of people. So this, I think, is a fact of fundamental importance. And I think outside the territory, at least, hardly anybody knows about this. And I think even inside the territory, most people often find it difficult to figure out just what's gone on. They know it's happened on the ground, but what's the policy? Where's all the bits of paper about this? The Commonwealth Government tried to keep this MOU secret, but it fell off the back of a truck. And so it's now publicly available. So the question is, what has happened to outstations and homelands as a result of these policies? So if you look at the population statistics, we find that today there are approximately 6,500 people living in 380 homelands communities. In 2006, there were about 10,000, maybe more, living in about 560 communities. So from that to 6,500, that is a big decline. That's a big population loss at the time that the Aboriginal population of the Northern Territory has been growing. So the decline in the number of people living in small communities, that's under 200 residents, so that includes some other communities that aren't outstations, but the figures recently worked out for that. That's been in a quite steep and unrelenting decline since 2007. People have gone to the larger communities or to town. So why? Well, they've gone basically because the housing stock is now very old, overcrowded, dilapidated. The NT government provides money for repairs and maintenance and improvements, but that's a fraction of what's needed. So there's no room for growth, no aspirations for the future, and as well other services, schools, health have been wound back as well. So without the chance to have new houses or to rebuild houses, the future must look pretty bleak for many people living in homelands and outstations, I think. Now, of course, Aboriginal people have shown independence and initiative, and they live in sheds, in caravans, etc., in order to stay on their lands, but it should not be like this. So that just brings me getting towards the end to what about the future? And I think the key thing to know on this strand is that the NT government has had a major review of Homeland's policy running for over a year. The consultant's report from this review is now finished and is with the Northern Territory government. That report could be very important, depending what is in it and how the NT government responds to it. But there may be some hope here, and I think it will be important for people to try and keep a close eye out for this report and the reaction of the government when it becomes public. One problem is the report will probably come out, or the report and the NT elections might overlap, so that might cause problems as well. But I made a submission to the review, but I only found out about the review really by accident. I'm not sure how many people are aware this review has been going on. I hope so, but I think it might be important. So in summary, the essential goals of Aboriginal policy settings in the Northern Territory has been sidelining traditional ownership in the townships, reasserting control over the lives of Aboriginal people, and slowly emptying the countryside of the many small to medium-sized communities referred as outstations and homelands. So I think the major objective now for all people concerned has to be to bring the Commonwealth Government back into the story for funding support for homelands and housing. It's not good enough for the Commonwealth to wash its hands of this responsibility and to marginalise homelands and outstations. So there may be hope, as I was saying, and I think perhaps the days of the hardline ministers might be over. You know, the Bruffs, the Vanstones, and maybe the even slightly softer hardliners from Labor. The times might be suiting homelands again, and maybe they'll be able to take their rightful place alongside other Aboriginal communities in the Territory. So when you put these three separate but intertwined strands together, you know, the leases, the intervention, the attack on homelands, the negative impact of the last 15 years comes into clear focus. When people have lived it, and you can see why once you start to pull these strands together. So this is the lived experience of Aboriginal people. This is a tsunami that has to be turned back for people to regain self-determination and dignity. These have been, I think, the wasted years. Okay, thanks, Larissa.
Thank you very much. And, you know, I think it's important after listening to your very thoughtful analysis to once again acknowledge how it's been the First Nations people throughout the Northern Territory that have continued to be a voice that can't be ignored on this issue. Yeah. Greg, did you have anything to say?
No, I don't think so. Thanks, Larissa. Listening carefully. I mean, it's all, I find it very interesting, but it's all distressing, of course. And one of the frustrating things is we knew 13 years ago or 15 years ago where this was all going to end up. And it's a combination of deliberateness in policymakers and stupidity at the same time. It's very frustrating, but I think that Mark and others are right. You just have to keep bashing away and finding a way through. Yeah, thanks.